Hello, Australian Prime Minister. Today I'm here to talk to you about neorealism versus neoliberalism and how you can use this in your foreign affairs policies. So, for a basic understanding of the differences, in neorealism and neoliberalism, states are the main actors in an anarchic international society. The main difference is that neorealists argue that states are always going to have to compete with each other within this society, whereas neoliberalists argue that through international institutions and regimes, states can become cooperative. Now, what is an anarchic society? That is basically the international system has no overhead of the states within that system. There's nothing about the states that can determine what they do versus what they don't do. Now, neorealism has two different versions of what states can be in the anarchic society. It is revisionist states, and they alter the balance of power. So basically, they're going to try to gain power in the international system, but to become more powerful. And in order to do that, they're going to take away power from other states, thereby altering the balance of powers within that system. Whereas status quo states, they're satisfied with the way the balance of powers currently is, and they don't really want to change it, but they're going to maintain enough power to stay within their spot on the balance of powers. The main difference here is that the main problem is that you can never really tell what's a revisionist state versus a status quo state, and therefore you don't really know how to act towards other states within the system, as they could be status quo one day, a revisionist next. Now, neoliberalists do agree that it's going to be hard to break the mistrust that is intrinsic in an anarchic society. However, they believe that through collective desires, the international system can play a role to become more cooperative and more transparent. Now, this is a little design I have. It is for neorealist, and I have Kenneth Waltz up there, who is a defensive neorealist, and I have a neoliberalism on the other side, and it has Robert Keon. He's a neoliberalist theorist. And these are the differences, and that's the same. And right now, I have states are rational actors, as they both believe that, and that it's an anarchic international system, which they also both agree is how the international system is ordered and works. Now, we have hegemony in the state, neorealism. So for neorealists, there's really two camps, and that's going to be defensive and offensive. And this discusses hegemony and the benefits and costs within this. So, defensive realist Kenneth Waltz, which I just discussed, he argues that states should always look for an appropriate amount of power within the system for survival rather than becoming a hegemony. He argues that they should use an offense-defense balance to determine the difficulty of conquering another state, whereas offensive realists argue that states should always try to become hegemonies as it's best for their survival. They'll be able to have better military power than anyone else in the system, have more power over other states if they're a hegemony within the region. And both of these conclude that nuclear capabilities have shifted the balance of powers a little bit, because great powers aren't really going to want to go to war with each other, because nuclear war is just horrible for both of their survival if that were to be what happened. Now, hegemony in the state, neoliberalism. Hegemony is a bit different for neoliberalism, as instead of viewing it as a powerful act, they view it a little bit more in a positive light. So they view neoliberalism through an American hegemony, and they consider it a building block for further interdependence within the international system. So they argue that the United States was able to create international institutions that can be used for a long time after the United States is no longer a hegemony, to continue with peaceful cooperation and transparency between the states, and this will create a more cooperative international system in the long run. So right now, hegemony is really input in all of them, so I have them as the same. However, they view them in almost a little different of lights. So neorealists view hegemony as power, whereas neoliberalists view hegemony as a building block for cooperation within the international system. So, balancing of powers, neorealism, and polarity. So, states are rational actors that will not act in a way that hurts their position in the balance of powers. So within this, there's three different types of polarity. So bipolarity is when there's two great powers in the international system. Now, some neorealists argue that this is the most peaceful version of the system because the states are always going to be against each other and there's less opportunity to fight each other within that. And there's always going to be more equality between the great powers because there's only two of them. And they also must confront each other and there's less room for miscalculations. So they're always going to be looking at each other, so it's easier when you're monitoring one state all the time that you're not going to miscalculate what they're doing as often. Whereas in a multipolarity state, this is three or more great powers in the international system. And neorealists who believe that this is the most peaceful argues that deterrence is higher because more states can ally together to confront one state trying to become a hegemony. And the attention is going to be split between multiple states, which will enable them to be more peaceful in the end because they're not always constantly staring at each other. And then we also have unipolarity. This is when there's one great power. It's been argued that the United States is a hegemony, especially after World War II, after the Cold War. But there's really can't be any wars between great powers in this system because there's only one great power. However, it's not necessarily going to lead to world peace, as if that hegemony leaves a region, regional wars can break out, either through money, latent power, or by going through actual war. And then the hegemony might also use its power to direct politics in other regions of the world that it's not necessarily supposed to be in. So the balancing of powers, neoliberal hegemon, and international institutions. So neoliberalists argue that hegemony can be used to build a trustful and international society. However, neoliberalists like Robert Keon argue that once the international institution has been established, the hegemony can falter after that, therefore it can fall because the institutions have already been built up. Now, there's a few ways that institutions maintain more cooperation within the international society, and one of those ways is bargaining. So bargaining within the international society establishes rules, dispute resolution procedures, and will maintain a legalized process for the states so they can be able to be more transparent and cooperate with each other within the institutions themselves. Now, defection is a fear within all bargaining agreements that within the anarchic society. So they argue that international institutions can use compliance and enforcements to stop defection of an agreement. So compliance is when a state is encouraged to abide by an agreement. An example of this is states being constantly monitored by the institution to follow an agreement. And if you're constantly knowing what the other state is doing, you're more likely to abide by that agreement if you know they're keeping up their end of the bargain. And this can also stop things like a state just not participating or really holding up its end of the bargain at all. And enforcement is forcing a state to comply with an agreement, and this can be through things like sanctions. The issue with sanctions is that every state within that agreement must also agree to enforce a sanction on that state, which doesn't always happen. So they're not always completely useful in that enforcement. Now, the autonomy of international institutions has been questioned. It is part of the hegemony argument. However, international institutions, there's a principle theory that shows how much states can delegate their tasks to the institutions, and they argue this gives institutions a bit more autonomy. However, the delegation still promotes the interests of the states, so they're not fully autonomous, and it's still being argued within neoliberalism. So now I've added balancing power through polarity and power struggles, and balancing power through international systems. So these are completely different ways of looking at how power can be understood and the struggle of power being halted in the international system, which they don't really believe can be altered, the neorealists. Power distribution and hegemony. Neoliberalists contend that the international system and regimes, some states will always maintain power over others. As an example, some states maintaining power over others is going to be the Security Council and the UN. So it's basically the United States, United Kingdom, China, Russia, and France. They are always going to hold a bit more power. And within the anarchic system, Australia does not hold the same amount of power as the hegemons like the United States or the budding power of China. So institutions built by the United States after World War II will help cooperation after that and help Australia fit into the international model. Yeah, so neoliberalism argues that international institutions help maintain and control power in the international systems as states engage in transparency and cooperation underneath them. Australia, in this context, should engage in international institutions to promote itself and maintain peace. Within the international system, Australia should utilize game theory within its decision making. So basically, this is strategic bargaining to increase the likelihood of sums for your state. Now, the best game theory, the key role is they encourage transparency through exchange of information and monitoring each other's behavior, which neoliberalists believe can be done through international institutions. Now, Australia, stuck between a rock and a hard place. Australia is situated in the Pacific East, close to China, while holding more liberal values like the United States. The liberal values don't really matter much to neorealists. But China is a budding hegemon, while the United States has maintained being a great power. So within an offensive realist perspective, China is going to try to become a hegemon in the Pacific, and the United States is going to try to deter that. And this could happen through war or things like like war or the economic means. Defensive realist argues that China's rise will shift the balance of powers, but it could be more peaceful as the United States and other countries near it are going to hold it in check for this. And neoliberalists maintain that if China gains power over the United States, that the international institutions will remain cooperation and transparency in the international system despite the United States not being a hegemony anymore. Australian Labour Party and interest. So the Australia is right now the Prime Minister, you are in the Labour Party, and you have an interest in human rights and economics. You're big on workers' rights. So neorealists do maintain that economics are part of the power struggle in the international system. A state with more economic stability and capital can use their power over nations and for survival in the anarchic landscape. This is called latent power, using economic resources and people to hold power over other nations. However, neorealism does not concern itself with human rights at all, or regime types such as things like being a more liberal state like the United States versus being a more communist state like China. They're less likely, that doesn't really matter to neorealists, as they're all rational actors within the system and they're going to act that way. So the main goal of these states is survival. Neoliberalism, economics, and cooperation. So organizations like GATT, WTO, IMF, and the World Bank are international institutions that help regulate trade and distribute conversations on economic issues. GATT allows states to become more interdependent through exchanging information and reducing transaction costs. WTO replaced GATT, and they added more legal foundations, structural parameters, and substantive mandates. The organizations have been instrumental in creating more interdependence economically in the international world, but they do struggle with the United States leaving or disagreeing and pulling out of agreements, as the United States is still a great power, and this affects how those agreements go a little bit. The IMF and the World Bank, they're also international institutions, and they are used more so to help states give them loans, but they usually come with the cost of having to develop more liberal ideas within a state, and they promote things like human rights and capitalism. So neoliberalism and human rights. Now, neoliberalists do agree that we are in an anarchic society and that states are rational actors within themselves, but the international institutions in which they promote also deal with things like human rights. So the United Nations has formed the Declaration of Human Rights, and it uses things like human rights into its doctrines, and these include things like workers' rights. And the United Nations also has a Council for Human Rights under its scopes that promotes human rights across nations. So within neoliberalism, the institutions themselves promote human rights, and Australia, as a lot of their business right now has to do with workers' rights in the Labour Party, they can cope and build their strategy within that. So Australia policy and IR. So this is to stay within the scope of Australian Labor Party. The best action would be to follow a neoliberalist account of the world. Within the neoliberalist accounts, Australia should look to institutions to create further interdependence with great powers like China and the United States. Interdependence with the rest of the world will promote transparency and communication with other nations, reducing the fear of the archaic world. Institutions will enable Australia to promote their economic stability on the world stage, along with pushing policies for workers' rights and environmental rights. So basically, going within a neoliberalist point of view, Australia will be able to converse more with other states and reduce the fear of the anarchic society that they currently exist in. Australian IR, this is the more of the neorealist perspective. So Australian following a neorealist perspective should be paying close attention to the power race budding between the United States and China. As China begins to ascend into hegemony in the Pacific, Australia should be increasing their economic and military power for survival in that area. China will change the balance of powers in the international system, and now Australia should begin policy to ensure that China does not harm their position in the international landscape. Thank you, Australian Prime Minister. I hope that this helped you a lot with your foreign policy and being able to make decisions in a neorealist or neoliberalist perspective. Bye.